Thank you, Joe. First off, let me welcome each of you here to Heartland's 7th Emerging Issues Forum. It is great to see so many new faces in the room as well as familiar faces, and we are delighted to have each of you here. This is really an exciting time for Heartland Institute. In particular, I feel like it's a very exciting time for Heartland's Government Relations Department. The department has actually recently grown. We now employ 6 full-time government relations specialists in our Chicago office. In addition to that, we also have 4 satellite offices located in Washington, D.C., Tallahassee, Florida, Austin, Texas, and our newest one in Columbus, Ohio. Last legislative session, Heartland experts and staff were actually invited by legislators and visited more than a dozen states to host Capitol forums, testify before legislatures, and brief lawmakers on everything from the parent trigger to windstorm insurance. This year, with our expanded government relations department, we hope to visit even more states and become each of y'all's go-to resource for research, expert testimony, or for us to come and host a policy forum in your own state. As the nation's only 50-state think tank, the Heartland Institute is in a unique position to identify issues coming up in the legislatures across the country and to help educate lawmakers on these very issues. For this year's Emerging Issues Forum, we are excited to showcase some of Heartland's own in-house talent, if you will. Today you will hear from Heartland's growing list of policy advisors, managing editors from our newspapers, and legislative specialists, as well as some of the foremost experts from other of our ally organizations. The program aims to give you a glimpse of many of the issues that Heartland Institute has pinpointed as some of the top emerging issues in state legislatures across the country. There are also issues that Heartland will be focusing much of their time and attention on this year. I hope that you will find the program here today informative and helpful as you go back to your state capitals and tackle many of these very issues. With that, I'm going to introduce our first keynote speaker, and no, this handsome gentleman is not Congressman Joe Walsh. I actually got a call about 5 a.m. this morning from his chief of staff. Fortunately, there are votes that have to be made, so he sent his regret that he could not attend. I'm actually now 0 for 2 with actually getting congressmen or senators at our events and then them having votes or getting very sick. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Jay Lehr. He is our senior fellow and science director here at the Heartland Institute. After graduating from Princeton University at the age of 20 with a degree in geological engineering, he went on to receive the nation's first PhD in groundwater hydrology from the University of Arizona. He later became executive director of the National Water Well Association of Groundwater Scientists and Engineers. For the past 15 years, he has served as Heartland's science director, writing and speaking on our behalf. He spends more than 100 days a year on the road speaking to audiences ranging from 20 to 2,000 people. Jay has co-authored or edited 30 books, the most recent one being the Nuclear Energy Encyclopedia, published by John Wiley & Sons in July. That book, along with the efforts of Heartland's communications department, led to dozens of appearances on television and radio in the days and weeks following the terrible Japanese earthquake and tsunami of March 11th. At 75 years young, Jay is ranked in the top 10 of all Ironman triathletes in his age group in the entire world. That's part of... Yeah. I must also say that there are only 10 left in the world in that age group. He is an exercise and bicycling fanatic and holds a world record for skydiving at least once a month, every month for the past 34 years. It's astounding. I think you'll find Jay's insights into energy policy to be as fascinating as his career and hobbies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jay Lehr.
Thank you, John. I've been with Heartland now for 15 years as their science director. traveling around the country and speaking on their behalf. And during those 15 years, I've had enough time as a hobby to write a dozen books or co-author or collect library reference books, all of which have the Heartland Institute imprint on them. And the book that John mentioned, which got me on dozens of television and radio shows, is the first volume of a 4-volume encyclopedia of energy in general that I am the senior editor of, that will ultimately cover every aspect of energy, many of which I will speak to you this morning. And I brought this particular volume here with appropriately autographed to give to my boss, Joe Bast, and I'd like to do that right now.
Well, thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Joe.
All right.
Of kilowatts that we utilize in this country, and hope I can convince you to, so to speak, take it to the bank and recognize that every word I tell you is true and that it is critical to our nation that the public begin to understand it. I think, short of our declining education system, our government schools in this country, the energy issue is the most important one to our future, and it is the most misunderstood. Energy companies just do not know what direction to go in developing more electrical power for you. Fossil fuels, renewable energy, nuclear power, they're confused. Consumers can't separate their desire to be warm, fuzzy, and green with the economics of energy. Politicians, you all, are unsure where to drive your states in a direction that will give you a safe, secure, and abundant energy grid. Activists, some well-meaning, some definitely not well-meaning, drive a great deal of where we are in energy. I'm going to start off by making 3 statements to you, and then I'm going to back them up as the talk continues. And you're going to be hearing more about them later this morning. My first message is that the entire global warming situation that has driven so much of the anti-fossil fuel and pro-renewable energy is an absolute absurd fraud. Now, Heartland and our staff, James Taylor, always leading the charge, is out there every day arguing on the turf of the global warmists, the fearmongers, that there is actually an argument. I will point out to you later, there is no argument. The idea that man has any significant, measurable impact on the temperature of this planet is totally absurd. My second statement is that the physics of the universe make our ability to harvest wind and solar energy in an economical manner to help supply our energy grid is physically impossible. This is not a matter of improving technology, improving widgets, improving materials. It is physically impossible to harvest the wind that is so dispersed and does not blow all the time, or to harness the sun's rays and make them useful in other than a niche manner. And my third point, which might come as the biggest shock to you of all, is that our country is the richest energy country on this planet, that we today could easily be energy self-sufficient. If not, when combined with Mexico and Canada, North America dwarfs all other parts of the globe with regard to energy, certainly including Saudi Arabia, which frankly will soon be history. Now, how did we get to such a position, a wrong-headed position of misinformation? There are few people that know this story better than I. And I've given you the story in the handout, an article published in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago titled, "There Will Be Oil." This article describes a situation that I was heir to, involved in, going back into the 1950s. A mentor and colleague of mine by the name of Marion King Hubbard, who was literally a god of energy, fluid dynamics, groundwater, from the 30s through the 40s and the 50s when I was studying. And Mr. Hubbard, Dr. Hubbard, was a brilliant physicist, but an absolutely god-awful economist and politician, and a person who didn't understand the social fabric of society. And King Hubbard, in the 50s, when I knew him and was studying with him, calculated the use of petroleum and fossil fuels, particularly petroleum, in the world on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And he calculated a trend of that increasing use against the trend of our location of resources. So that back in the 50s, we were using less oil than we were finding. But each year we were using more oil and finding less oil. And he calculated that between 1965 and 1970, these two numbers would diverge, and we'd be using more every year than we were finding, and that was called peak oil. And he published an article about peak oil. It was a doom and gloom prediction. When that year came, and lo and behold, we were still discovering more oil, and we're not using more, we're not using more than we discovered. Instead of saying Mr. Hubbard was wrong, we didn't reach peak oil, the peak was moved out a decade. And the doomsayers said, okay, we didn't reach it by the end of the 60s, but we'll reach it by the end of the 70s. We didn't reach it by the end of the 70s. They again said Hubbard wasn't wrong, he just had the year wrong, and they moved it out to the end of the 80s. And that's been going on for decades. But because of that calculation, that wrong-headed calculation, which I'll explain further in a moment, we said, well, we're going to run out of fossil fuels. We have to harvest the wind and the sun and also biofuels, and the whole movement into renewable energy began and kept on going even though the peak was never reached. And the fact that wind turbines have been around all your lives and long before, that we've harvested energy from the sun all of your lives and long before, and that Henry Ford operated his first car on ethanol, didn't make people realize that they've been around so long there must be some reason they are not economical. And they are not economical for the reasons of the physics and the laws of the universe. And yet the government pours tens of billions of dollars into it continually. Now we've reached what my friend and colleague King Hubbard, who passed away in '89, missed, which all fearmongers, if they are sincere, miss, is that they don't understand our greatest resource. The late, great Julian Simon, who was also a close friend of mine, in his book, The Ultimate Resource, recognized what the ultimate resource is of mankind. It's the gray matter between your ears. He realized that we didn't move from the Stone Age to the Steel Age because we ran out of stones. Man is so resourceful, so technologically capable. Today we literally can see into the earth in 3 dimensions to locate oil and gas. Today we've developed technologies that allow us to harvest the fossil fuels that are in abundant supply. I won't say that we may not be short in 2 centuries, but I will say for sure we have 2 centuries worth of fossil fuel and gas and oil, coal, probably 1,000 years, and that we will never need and can never use effectively renewable energy. Today, we are rapidly becoming the leader in oil if we are allowed to drill for all the oil we control. We are already the leader in natural gas. We have always been number 1 in coal. We have unlimited nuclear resources. In Arizona, very recently, the largest uranium find in the entire country has been located, larger than anything we've ever had before. Virtually a lifetime of nuclear fuel. We have not yet been allowed to develop nuclear mines because our Department of Interior have put it off limits. Just as they have put off limits drilling offshore, just as they have put off limits the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, which holds 16 billion gallons of oil, just like they have put off drilling on our public lands. The estimate of our fossil fuel resources on federal lands is such that were they to be developed in the coming decade, they would bring royalties into our government coffers equal to $18 trillion. And yet we are not allowed to harvest. The Environmental Protection Agency, which a friend here in the audience, Sam Horowitz, has renamed the Enterprise Prevention Agency, is exactly that. At every turn, they are attempting to thwart progress in this country. Their plan is to expand their manpower in the next 5 years tenfold. Tenfold. They're not going to get away with it because in order to do that, it will require our retaining the current administration. I am the world's leading optimist. Anybody on the Heartland Institute will tell you, well, if you jump out of a plane every month for 34 years, you've got to be pretty optimistic. I mean, you wouldn't believe the weather and the snow piles and the rain that I've jumped through to get that stupid record, keep it going. I mean, I can't stop because, you know, what would I say to people who see me and say, you still skydiving? And I say no, they'd be so depressed. Or else be thrilled, I don't know which. But I am, you will never meet a more optimistic person. If this administration is sent back to office a year from now, I don't know from where my optimism will continue. As I lecture around the country, I never mention the name of the chap sitting in the White House. In fact, I generally say to people, I don't care who you vote for. As long as we get rid of Ken Salazar in Interior, Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy, who won a Nobel Prize for an experiment on lasers, which was very clever, but when it comes to energy, he is a moron. He actually believes, I mean, you'll all agree with me when I quote him. He believes that our entire electric grid can be operated on wind and solar power. Now, those of you who maybe don't totally agree with me, even though you should, who recognize the limitations of wind and solar, there's certainly nobody you know that honestly believes we can replace the entire grid with wind and solar, and yet he does. We've already talked about the Enterprise Prevention Agency that throws stuff at us at every single turn. How do they stop us? Well, I'll give you an example. It's going on this very day. The largest oil find in the United States, which may prove to be the largest oil find ever in the world, is in North Dakota. I was there on Monday. The Bakken oil field that runs under South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. I mean, literally, their reserves increase by the day as they learn more and more about it. They're in court today. They're in court today in front of EPA because someone found 28 birds in a waste pit in North Dakota. 28 tiny little unendangered birds. Nobody saw them die. I suspect I know how they got there. And they're in court for killing birds. Every year, wind turbines around the United States kill hundreds of thousands of birds. And yet 28 birds found in a pit are attempting to hold up development of the Bakken oil field. Every day you are reading about efforts to stop shale gas fracking. Let me tell you about shale gas fracking. We have been fracking our oil fields my whole career. I began in petroleum engineering. We were fracking wells back in the middle 50s. I know of not a single groundwater contamination problem with fracking oil wells. Today, state by state, they're trying to slow it down by saying we'll contaminate groundwater. The shale that we're fracking are thousands of feet below the surface. The groundwater we're drinking from is generally a few hundreds of feet below the surface. They are totally disconnected. The chances of contamination are slim to nil. And then they're holding it up based on the chemicals that are used. What are the chemicals that are used? Every single one of the chemicals used in fracking operations are in your food, in your cosmetics, at similar concentrations. The fluids have certain properties that reduce surface tension so that the sand that's placed in the fluids will hold open the fractures after they're created by high pressure. And some of the chemicals in the fracking fluid are there to destroy bacteria so bacteria doesn't grow and clog the openings in the fractures. You can drink these fluids. There's been some problem because some companies don't want to divulge their formulas, thinking that some other company doesn't have as good formulas. That is ridiculous, but that's what goes on. The jobs economically, they've been fracking shale in the Barnett Shale in Texas now for a decade, and 100,000 of the jobs Mr. Perry advertises in his presidential campaign are a direct result of shale development in Texas. Trying to develop wind it's really interesting because it reminds me of the famous painting of Don Quixote with his spear going at a windmill. It's that foolish and that stupidity. It was in Man of La Mancha, the famous play. Going after wind and thinking that we can harness something that blows not very often, that requires 200 square miles of windmills to be the equivalent of a single coal-fired power plant, 1,000 megawatts. And no single fossil fuel power plant has been dismantled as a result of the development of wind, because you can never dismantle 100% rolling reserve backup, because when the wind stops blowing, you have to maintain the grid at the same level it was before, or we have brownouts and blackouts. So you have to have standing ready, rolling, operating fossil fuel plants. The folly of solar. We're building more and more photovoltaic cells. They're great. I would like to put a photovoltaic cell on every hut in Africa so that life didn't begin when the sun comes up and end when the sun goes down, when kids could study at night and teachers could mark papers. They have no electricity. They can't afford major electric programs, but they could afford a photovoltaic cell hanging on the roof of every hut to light a light bulb. But in this country, other than your watches and your computers, they have little value. The state of New Jersey is putting them on the top of all buildings. They'll be sitting there rotting away 10 years from now, and yet they're spending a fortune putting them up. In 10 years, this country will be riddled with windmills standing, not turning. Most of you have gone by wind farms already, and you see some windmills not turning. In 10 years, you won't see any turning at all. The printing presses will stop supporting the 55 cents on the dollar. The maintenance costs will not be raised, and the country will be populated with tens of thousands of wind turbines that add nothing to our electrical grid. But the question is, I know that will happen. I mean, you can mark down today, and I'm telling you where we'll be in 10 years. The question is, will we be bankrupt by then? Can we stop this colossal waste of money before we go bankrupt? And it's all driven by this global warming fraud. In your packets that have been given out to you is a diagram that was developed by my friend Sam Horowitz to show in an instant, and I've been showing it everywhere, and it has great impact. And it shows all the greenhouse gases that make our planet habitable. Carbon dioxide is green. Without it, this planet would be a frozen globe. Without it, we would not have vegetation, because carbon dioxide is the lifeblood of vegetation, as oxygen is ours. And we have a greenhouse gas envelope, and the diagram will show you the green dots are water vapor, which make up 90% of our greenhouse envelope. Show you that methane makes up 4%, nitrous and sulfur oxides dots make up 2%, carbon dioxide makes up 4%. But man's contribution to the carbon dioxide is 3% of that 4%. Most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes continually from the oceans and decaying vegetation. And so when you get a chance to look at that diagram, there are a few little black dots in the lower right-hand corner that are man's contribution. Common sense should tell you that that tiny amount is not having anything to do with a measurable impact of the temperature of the planet. And it doesn't matter because carbon dioxide is good. In the years since we have been adding CO2, everything is growing better. We have more green mass on the equator. A small percentage of our increased yields in crops is a result of it. In conclusion, we have two critically important needs, and you're all in a position to influence these needs. The first is to make the public understand the folly of renewable energy. It has no impact at all on reducing greenhouse gases, and if it did, it would end up being a negative. It is uneconomical today and will be forever. We will never produce electrical energy from wind and solar anywhere close to double what our conventional costs are, and they'll be closer on the average to 5 times our cost. We can produce biofuels, and we have a law that says by 2022 we have to produce 36 billion gallons of biofuel, a law that was driven by the military that in the worst of all times they felt we could grow our own homegrown fuel. We don't have to grow it. We mine it, we drill for it. But does it make sense, really, even though it can be economical to have biofuels, does it make sense to burn our food to make fuel? It doesn't. So our first charge to you is that we've got to slow and eliminate this whole absurd charge to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy. We have to concurrently convince the public that we can be energy independent. We don't need to be. We have friendly neighbors to the north and south that can certainly more than supply well over all our energy needs for the foreseeable future. But we could be independent if we wanted to, if the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior and EPA and the rest of our government gave us a break. But the second area is more nefarious and more of a problem. Most of you heard the name Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb, in which he predicted famine in the United States by 1980. He has continued to make fear-mongering predictions his entire career, for which he's gotten all kinds of awards, is on television all the time. He got a MacArthur Genius Award. Based on many of my tests in school, when I flunked, I should have gotten a Genius Award. But he just is wrong. But it all comes down to a statement he made in a publication in a science journal in 1978. And here is the real crux of the matter, and something you've got to understand, something you've got to act on. He said in writing, I have the publication in 1978, finding a cheap, abundant source of energy for mankind would be like putting a machine gun in the hands of an idiot child. I'll say it again. He said, finding a cheap and abundant source of energy for mankind would be the equivalent of putting a machine gun in the hands of an idiot child. And his followers, and there are many of them, want to return our planet to some period when man didn't exist, when they think the world was a better place. And their goal is to thwart progress. Global warming and renewable energy have been the mechanisms to do that, and they're doing a very good job of it. So we really have two things that we have to do. One, we've got to change administrations. I mean, we have just got to get rid of the people I've already mentioned. And then once we do, we have to make sure that the new people that come into Interior and EPA and Energy understand the things I've been telling you and stop restraining progress in this country. This is an incredible audience because you're all in decision-making places where you can begin to share this, not just on the floors of your legislature, but at your dinner tables, at your social events. We have 13 months, less than 13 months, to convince this nation of the mistakes they're making and make sure when we change administration, we move off in a totally different direction in energy, because we are the richest energy country in the world. Thank you.